Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Future of Dynamic Capacity, Building Pricing Control and Automation into Your TMS. My name is Nick Reikus, Marketing Coordinator at the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals. I am seeing that we have attendees still joining the webinar, so while we wait a few moments to allow them in, I would like, on behalf of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, to sincerely thank our members and subscribers for their continued support, which makes it possible for us to deliver this type of cutting-edge content. For anyone interested in CSCMP membership or subscription information, additional details can be found on the cscmp.org website, along with the listing of upcoming webinars and events. Attendees on this webinar are muted for a better webinar experience, but we definitely would love for you to submit your questions throughout the broadcast using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, please note that the rebroadcasting or retransmitting of this webinar is strictly prohibited without the proper authorization from CSCMP. With that out of the way, I would like to introduce our presenters for today's event. Mike Evans, Loadsmart's Senior Manager of Strategic Solutions, and Jim Gear, Vice President of Solution for MercuryGate. Take it away, Mike and Jim.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Evans, the Strategic Solutions Manager here at Loadsmart. I've been with the organization for a little over 2 years now, in the industry for over 18 years. Before I pass it over to Jim here to give introductions, I just want to take a second to thank CSCMP for having us here today, for Jim and MercuryGate for presenting with us, and for everybody who's attending to learn a little bit more about how we are driving innovation in the industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Jim Gear. I've been with MercuryGate for 13 years, in the TMS space for 20, and transportation for 40 years. Happy to be here today, and once again, appreciate it. Thanks out to CSCMP.
For those of you who aren't familiar with Loadsmart, we are a logistics platform optimizing how freight is moved through a combination of automation and data intelligence. We are based out of Chicago. We have over 750 employees, 40% of which are either engineers or data scientists. So we definitely lead with technology, and we complement our business with strategic partnerships. As of last month, we announced the close of our Series D fundraising round, which brought us to a total of over $340 million raised. Some of our strategic investors include SoftBank and BlackRock. And I'll pass it over to Jim to give you a quick intro to MercuryGate.
So MercuryGate's a world-class enterprise TMS. We also have final mile solutions, claims management as well. Within that group of, we have over 600 customers. We're innovating in various areas right now, all the way from drone technology, AI, advanced analytics through our product suite, and over 750 or 75 billion freight under management within those different products. So what we want to talk about today is really around our partnership with Loadsmart to help kind of smooth out this disruption we're seeing out there, and the uncertainty that's being caused through capacity constraints, right? So your contracted rates aren't holding up. Your acceptance, even through your backup through spot quoting, and that is reduced. So you're losing lead time. So not only is it costing you more, your service levels are impacted with your customers, and within the spot market, which we've seen a threefold increase in because your contracted rates aren't holding, is that rate volatility. It's really hard to predict now what those rates are going to be, and then the inconsistent capacity, and then it gets extremely time intensive, right, around that as well. So of trying to cover those loads and that above and beyond the cost at times.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of that from our customers too, Jim. It's, you know, they used to do annual RFP exercises where they could award most of their freight for the year through that annual event, and then, you know, do some maybe quarterly or monthly mini bids, which would allocate just a small amount of freight. But we've seen a lot of customers shift over to actually withholding much of their network freight to move completely to either quarterly or even monthly mini bids, really to keep that, you know, the pricing in line with the market. so they don't have those high tender rejection rates and as much flow through to the spot market, where they do tend to see less consistency among the carriers and more rate volatility for sure. So something that we're working to solve and provide customers with options to drive more efficiency and reliability within their route guides.
So how do we manage that uncertainty, right? Through your TMS, you want to provide as much automation as possible. That uncertainty disrupts that automation. And so your pricing becomes much more dynamic out there, right? And so how do we bring that into control? And we're going to talk more and more about that today, and still be able to provide or use those automated controls, because those interruptions really stop that process, and that's where you lose time, and your costs start to increase both internally and externally with your carriers.
Yeah, very difficult to rely on the dynamic pricing without having some sort of controls in place. So it's kind of a trade-off between getting all the benefits of the efficiency and the dynamic pricing, but how much more could you potentially spend if you don't have the proper oversight, which really isn't the true functionality intended for that that configuration within your TMS.
So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. How does MercuryGate work with dynamic rate providers such as Loadsmart? Keep in mind that that's guaranteed capacity. So when you get to a point of using one of your dynamic rate providers, you're going to get coverage there, and that might be quite a bit more expensive than what you maybe want to incur on that move or what you expect. So that's something to keep in mind. And within the TMS, you want to make that one rating call, right? You want to be able to see across your providers what those costs are, or from an automated standpoint, picking the lowest cost provider and then cascading or sequencing through those tenders until you finally get an acceptance. When you hit that dynamic rate provider, you're going to get an acceptance. So those are things to keep in mind when you're setting up your business rules and your processes and your automations within your TMS. Within those providers, such as Loadsmart, you have those integrations already built and available. So it's a matter of requesting and turning that on. Also, reach out to Loadsmart and make sure that you have everything set up there. Mike's going to talk a lot more about that. The value in bringing that on board is quickly and easily add capacity, right? You can bring on those providers. You now have coverage on a lot of those lanes that you were out trying to find before through various methods, kind of more traditional things like spot quotes, load boards, and things like that. So once that's added, you're going to be able to seamlessly take advantage of those providers through our technology within the TMS. Also keep in mind there's no upgrades or different versions necessary for this. It's going to be just part of your rating process within the TMS as well. So Mike, anything to add to that? Or
no, I think you covered it well. And on the next slide here, I'm going to talk about kind of how we're starting to approach the API pricing, but also reinforcing some of the things that you just touched on. Again, what Jim just said is that it's really important to be able to leverage that dynamic pricing within your route guide to gain those efficiencies and not have to sit there and again touch every single load, especially if you're used to doing batch quoting, batch tendering, things like that within your route guide. You don't have to go back through it and check everything or wonder if you're overspending on the shipments. So whenever you're working with through MercuryGate with Loadsmart here, again, we are already integrated with MercuryGate, so there's nothing to do on your end. There's no extensive setup process to go through. If there is any sort of an integration cost for enabling the Loadsmart API specifically, we will cover those charges, so it is completely free for you to test us out. You just need to basically go, contact your MercuryGate rep about how to enable us specifically, which is a pretty quick process. And ultimately, there's no obligation to move loads with us. So anybody attending, this call who's interested in seeing what we have to offer, you can go through no cost again, turn us on within your TMS, and just take a look at our pricing. Start receiving some rate calls. You're in a few slides here, I'm going to show you what it looks like within your TMS, more or less. But you'll have that option, and honestly, more than 9 times out of 10, once customers start seeing our pricing, they get used to the toll. They see how efficient it really is. You're more than likely going to give us a chance to start moving freight, and then we'll officially begin our relationship together. One other important call out here, just it touches on the modes here below, is dry van, reefer, and flatbed. We do offer instant rating for all 3 of those modes. We were first to market with dry van and reefer years ago. Flatbed has been a more recent development. There's very few carriers that do offer that through API pricing. So we hope that there's some customers on this call today who have a flatbed mode and are interested in leveraging technology to help with some of that rate discovery. You can move on to the next slide, Nick. Yeah. So we touched on kind of what is dynamic pricing. Here we want to get into how it works. So on the right here, you have a visual representation of a shipment that you've planned in your TMS from Dallas to Houston. Most route guide waterfalls are positioned sequentially by price. So our Loadsmart rate in most configurations is going to come in and be an option for you that's instantly bookable. Again, our program is if we quote it, we're going to accept it. So there's 100% guaranteed tender acceptance. We're not going to give back the load, and we're not going to change the price for the shipment either. So here's another visual just to kind of help you picture how we're pricing this and how our algorithm works. Basically, it factors in hundreds of different data points to generate a bookable rate within a matter of seconds. So the rate discovery process is very efficient. Most importantly, it's going to look at lane data, origin, destination, what kind of equipment are you looking for, when is it picking up, how much lead time do we have, because obviously lead time is a very critical component of pricing, but then also historical data and capacity data for that same lane. So a lot of things go into it, but ultimately our algorithms are able to price that near instantaneously and deliver that right back into your TMS quickly.
So one of the things you might be thinking right now is if Loadsmart will accept the load regardless, and you have an automated process where you're doing some cascade tendering, sequential tendering, how do I prevent over cost, right? Where do I stop that process? And that's really without what Mike's talking about here and going to talk about. And you have an automated process, you have some concern. And so I think with what Mike's going to explain around dynamic pricing, you can continue to use that automation and be comfortable with that cost control as well. So, Mike?
Yeah, very important. Just one point too before we go to the next slide, Nick, is just talking about overspending risk. I just want to say, in general, API carriers haven't done a great job of educating customers over the last few years and having open and honest conversations about risk, because most of these programs started coming to market a few years ago when it was more about a value prop of savings in a softer market. So dynamic rates within your route guide might maybe your primary rejects a shipment, maybe that second position would be filled by a Loadsmart with a more competitive rate than some of your secondary backup positions. But then with the onset of COVID and the disruption that took place and the impacts on demand, it really shifted that value proposition over to access to capacity and very easy access, efficient access to capacity in a volatile market. So the risk goes both ways. There's obviously the risk of maybe tendering more loads to an API provider than you want or at higher rates than you want. But for those of us that are offering these guaranteed acceptance programs, there's a lot of risk on our end too, because ultimately we need to service that business at a high level. We have to go to market and buy capacity or buy the trucks individually. And if there are times when a customer could send 10 or 20 loads in a single lane, the more capacity you need to buy in a single market or even a single lane, that there's an incremental increase in that cost of capacity that we need to factor in. So there's a lot of things that go into automated pricing or whether or not you receive a rate response from an API provider because of those commitments that we make by backing up all of our pricing. So I just want to touch on that, and that's at Loadsmart, we've taken that to heart. We understand that customers didn't always understand that. They just saw the downside of overspending, or whatever they were seeing invoices and things, or anecdotal feedback from other experiences that they had with other carriers. We knew we needed to solve for that to give them more control over their pricing, so that they could really get the best of both worlds, right? That they get the efficiency from the dynamic pricing, but without that concern that requires a certain level of oversight to audit every single transaction. So how we were able to solve for that, ultimately, last year, we developed a new functionality in our system, which is our API rate guard. Nick, if you want to go to the next slide. So I know there's a lot going on in the slide, but essentially our rate guide, or I'm sorry, our rate guard essentially acts as a rate ceiling for our customers. So what we do is we agree on a benchmark that we use with our customers, and this is employed at the lane level. So the example here to the right, you have a shipment from New York City to Chicago. The solid green line represents the benchmark, the industry benchmark. And you can see here that there's a lot of volatility in most lanes over the course of the last couple of years have seen at least some level of volatility. So it was important for us to, for our solution to also be dynamic and to move with the market, because it doesn't do any good to set maybe a static price or a static threshold above whenever rates are so volatile that eventually that ceiling doesn't act the way it should, and either you're potentially overpaying, or maybe you're not receiving the support that you need. So what we've done is we employ a ceiling, which is a percentage over a benchmark value. So we sit down with our customers, we look at data, and I'll get more into this on upcoming slides. But we agree on a ceiling that makes sense to deliver the sort of program results that a customer wants. And you can see here, if our rate falls below that ceiling value, we're going to send it back to the TMS, and it's instantly bookable. And in many cases, if it's in that dynamic route guide setting, it's going to be auto-tendered to us if there are rejections ahead of it. But if it's over that threshold, then we don't return a rate response to your TMS. So talking with our shippers who are active in these programs with us now, we've asked for feedback, and overwhelmingly, the feedback has been positive. The number one benefit that they've communicated to us is just the planner's time that is being saved. Typically, a lot of shipments were falling through those route guides. Ultimately, they have to be moved over into a spot channel, bid out. As Jim touched on earlier, there's a lot of time wasted going through a waterfall. If you have 10 or 15 positions in your waterfall, that could take hours or even up to a day, depending on how responsive your carriers are, timing out versus sending an instant rejection if they don't want to accept the tender. So we're obviously increasing the efficiency and the effectiveness of the route guide setting, so you don't have to go into spot and manage it there, which obviously reduces your flow through the spot and the volatility you see there. We talked earlier about how there's a lot more inconsistency with the carriers that are moving your freight when you go into the spot channels, where there tends to be a much higher number of carriers that are participating. Some have 50, 75 carriers in those channels, so freight could go in a lot of different directions. But this is obviously funneling to Loadsmart. It's a more consistent experience, fewer touch points from a communication standpoint. It's providing additional reliable capacity. And again, the responsiveness is there because we are delivering those rates in your TMS within a matter of seconds. So to dig a little deeper into how this works, when we initiate these programs with our existing customers, we do a very thorough quote and book analysis. So we run some data, and it's essentially every single quote request that we've seen over a period of time. We break that down into a few different views, but ultimately it's what are we quoting, what are we not? The things that we're not quoting, why are we rejecting those? That's kind of a separate conversation, but it does have an impact I can talk about a little bit later. All the things that we are quoting, what are we winning? And when we're winning those loads, where are we positioned against the benchmark that we're using to employ these programs? So, most customers may not really truly understand where they buy in the market, and certainly not all shippers are created equal. There's different freight characteristics that go into it, flexibility, quality of appointments, cancellation rates, all those things that affect whether or not you're a shipper of choice or how attractive the rates are that you're receiving from carriers. So we're very transparent. We go through that. and we basically say, okay, here's where we think we should position these rate ceilings to deliver the most value, to get the kind of results that you want. It's a very collaborative process that we go through with our customers to find an appropriate ceiling. More often than not, we start on the conservative side, and then there's a regular cadence for us to review the results, see if adjustments are appropriate. There's a lot of customization options that I'm going to get into in the slides that are upcoming. But it's really important for us to at least initially have regular reviews together where we're making sure that everything is being dialed in and we're ultimately working together to maximize the number of rate responses that you're getting from us, ultimately the number of loads that you need both through carriers, and it's providing very valuable intelligence that you can actually apply to other carrier relationships as well. So I'm going to get into a few different scenarios of how we can apply our API rate card. We have been able to build on these. Some of these are very new, but they're very impactful too. And it seems like the more that we engage with our customers, and we have, especially those follow-up meetings, we keep uncovering other ways that we can kind of shift our logic and apply a new rule set to really start to dial things in and give them even greater control. So yeah, the very first program that we did was just a single setting rate card. And we realized, yeah, after a couple of months that we can do more. We can find ways to really start to dial this in and give customers just a better quality product and much more control over the settings overall. So you can go to the next slide. So the first is location based. So you think about it, we can set up a different ceiling settings for any city, state, zip, or even a key market area. So appropriate considerations for this would be seasonal impact like produce. So you don't necessarily want to have a ceiling that's set across your entire network in the United States when only the Southeast is really being impacted by more rate volatility because of the impact of produce coming up the coast. So we can more or less exempt the Southeast from the rest of the rate ceiling and maybe provide more support through a higher rate ceiling in that specific area. Or you might have a short-term surge, plant outage, something like that shifts your production and your volumes a bit, where your dedicated fleet or your primary carriers can't absorb. So maybe you need some temporary support for a week or a month, something short-term like that, where if we left the ceiling the same, there's a chance that you're not going to receive the level of support you need, but say, hey, we're willing to spend a little bit more. Let's bump that ceiling up just in this specific location. That's going to give you some of the support you need. And then obviously weather is a very unpredictable disruption that has a huge impact last year and obviously again this year. So we want to give you the ability to toggle those things up or down and turn them on and off very quickly. Next example is mode-based rate ceilings. You can customize the rate guard by dry van, reefer, and flatbed. Why that's important, basically there's a lot of density with dry van. There's a lot of lane density and capacity out there. So there's a little bit less volatility within that mode. You get your reefer, especially in the winter, they're more in demand. There's more volatility in the cost of trucks, especially in certain markets, that basically when you're comparing to an industry benchmark, you might want to have a little bit more of a percentage difference there for that volatility so that you can get some of the support you need and not have a significant percentage of the calls that you're sending to Loadsmart be rejected because of the rate ceiling. And then same goes for flatbed. There's even less capacity in the marketplace for flatbeds, and especially in the summer months when construction's hot. You might want to get some more support there. And so again, you're going to have access to that support for these other modes without impacting dry van specifically. Potentially the most impactful application that we've come up with recently is mileage-based rate ceilings. So the graph to the right shows an analysis we did of a significant chunk of our large enterprise customers. We analyzed the rates and their variance against a benchmark by length of haul. So in this example here, we show 250-mile buckets, and there's a correlation between the length of haul and the variance to a benchmark. So essentially, if you're in that low mileage band, you figure it's only $300 or $400 well, if you have to spend $500 or $600 to move a load, obviously adding a couple $100 to a low dollar amount from a percentage perspective, it's going to have a bigger percentage impact. So, but then as you over the length of haul, as you get into the $2,000, $3,000 line haul situations, a couple $100 doesn't make as much of an impact from a percentage standpoint. So really important if customers have a pretty wide distribution of length of haul across their supply chain, that we figure out which mileage buckets make sense for them. And it's not just necessarily a one size fits all. So if you have a very regional structure, you don't have much long haul, then you might not need something like this. But for those that have obviously a longer footprint, it's really important for us to dial those in. And it doesn't have to be in 250-mile buckets. Again, when we go through the quote and book analysis, we're going to look and make recommendations based on mileage tiers that actually make sense. So it could be 0 to 350 and 351 to 5, and so on. But we let the data lead us to what is appropriate. We have conversations about it. And really, if I didn't mention it before, this isn't a set it and forget it type program. This is an ongoing, it's a long-term partnership. It's a strategic partnership with our customers. So over time, we're going to keep coming back to you with more data, talk about what we're seeing, revisit what the goals for the programs are, and then we're going to make adjustments that make sense for everybody involved. So, but this mileage-based one is one that is actually making more and more sense with most of our customers, and we're starting to employ that more often. So the last one is time sensitive. So it's kind of a situational, but part of our process, again, when we have these meetings with customers, is to look at the quote data and see, well, what are we rejecting because it's over the rate ceiling, right? And sometimes depending on the customer and where they want, how much support they want through the DRG or through their route guide, they might keep a relatively low setting. So we look at that data and see what we're rejecting. But we ask, a lot of questions about where do you need more support ultimately. They say a lot of times it's end of month where there's a surge price, which isn't really ever factored into a short industry benchmark. Low lead time, which is defined as anything less than 48 hours, which most carriers in the market are starting to increase their rates around that 48-hour mark. As they approach zero lead time, the rates get significantly higher. So those are more likely to be over any kind of a rate ceiling as well. The same goes for weekend pickups, which obviously there's a lot less capacity on weekends as drivers do their, reset their hours and things like that. So we can actually build in another layer of logic to actually provide a higher rate ceiling at specific times of the month, lower lead time, so that the main logic applies to everything more than 48 hours. There's a separate set of rules where you might want to add 10 or 15% to your ceiling to get more rate options under 48 hours, and then the same goes for weekends. So again, there's a ton of customization options that we're delivering to customers to give them that level of control and the level of support. And really what we found is there's so much value to having these conversations and the data that helps us position these rate ceilings. But there's also this spillover effect where, we're talking about, okay, well, here's what percentage of your quotes are weekend or are low lead time. That opens up some eyes to say, well, I didn't realize that 42% of our shipments technically qualify as low lead time. Let's see if we can do something about that, or which facilities are driving these behaviors. It exposes some of those things, and in most cases, if it's affecting our rates, it's affecting all of your carriers' rates. So over time, what we're seeing is that customers are able to address some of these things that are within their controls, improve their network overall, improve the experience for other carriers. And ultimately, that's going to lead to more rate responses from Loadsmart, better rates from Loadsmart, and then more and better rates from their other carriers as well. So I believe that's the end of our prepared content. So I'm going to pass it back over to Nick, because it looks like we do have some time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I did see one question that came across for you, Mike and Jim. What happens within the Mercury Gate TMS if the rate cards kick in and Loadsmart doesn't return a rate?
I guess I can take that, or Jim, if you want to.
Go ahead, Mike.
On our end, we do, technically we do send a rejection through the TMS with a reason. My understanding in talking to any of our TMS partners, I don't think that the reason information is typically there. It is something that when we go through the quote and book analysis, we do share every type of rejection that takes place. We're very transparent with all of our rejections. We talk about why, and again, how over time can we work towards getting a higher rate response rate, sorry, from Loadsmart, so that you're getting more options. But on the other side, if you're within your route guide and you're looking at your options, you're just not going to see a Loadsmart rate populate within that route guide setting. So assuming you have no other API provider and there's no acceptance, then it would still flow through and probably fall into one of your spot channels from there.
I just want to add that typically you're in a sequential or automated process of handling multiple carriers, and we don't want to populate a no rate in that process. So it's pretty much that Loadsmart just doesn't support that lane, and that's the TMS will carry on at that point in time, and eventually you'll probably have an exception that you need to manage and for coverage if you run out of carriers.
Gotcha. So it looks, thanks for answering those. It looks like we've got a couple questions from Alan and Christine here, who are either saying that they had to join a few minutes late or had to leave early, and are wondering if the recording will be available after the call. I can go ahead and field this one. Yes, we will be sending video replays to all those that registered for the webinar within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. So please feel free to be looking through your inbox and checking your email, and we should be getting to a replay to you pretty shortly. It does look like we have a question from Joshua here, who is wondering, he says, good afternoon and thank you. Does Loadsmart offer partial or shared truckload quotes?
Technically, we do. We do not through our existing integrations with most of our TMS partners. That is something that we're actually working on right now this year, I think this quarter even, so that eventually we will be able to do PTL, LTL, and even intermodal through API. But at this point, that is not enabled yet.
Great. So another question here is, how often can I adjust the rate cards?
Honestly, as often as a customer wants. Typically, whenever we implement one of these programs, say we were just doing the most basic version possible, all of your freight is within 250 miles. You can just do a single setting. So say you did 40% over the benchmark. When we go in and we load that logic into our system, we'll also do a range of other options, usually in 5% increments, but there's no limit to what you can do. It can be 12% or 6% or any number you want. So we'll go ahead and we'll load up. So say we wanted to do 40%, we would do 45, 50, 55, and then 5% increments the other way as well. So then it's locked and loaded. And then if a customer reaches out, and this has happened fairly often, and they say, hey, we're starting to slow down a little bit. We don't need quite as much support as we needed before. Can you knock it down 10%? And we can, within a matter of 1 minute, have those changes implemented within our system, and it's going to affect every quote that's received from then on out. So we try to position it to be as agile as possible. If you were to come to us and say, hey, all of a sudden I want to change something drastically or employ the mileage-based setting to completely change it, then we might need half a day to a day to implement those changes.
Great. I apologize in advance on this one. I don't want to botch any names, but I believe Aniket is asking, are the rate ceilings determined dynamically or index-based?
Well, there's a benchmark. I'm not allowed to share externally. We certainly can in customer conversations, but due to contracts, there's some limitations there. But the benchmark that we use, it is an industry benchmark. The only way for us to employ it right now is based on a percentage above or below the benchmark. So I hope that answers the question, but it is absolutely a dynamic comparison, which is very important, we believe, because it always keeps it in line with the market regardless of what's going on.
Awesome, thank you. Another question here from Eric. How do we enable Loadsmart and TMS so we can start comparing quotes? And do we set up Loadsmart as a carrier like any asset-based carrier?
From a MercuryGate perspective, you will need to reach out to your contact, whether that's support or you can reach out to sales. So either support at mercurygate.com or sales. And we do have to turn that connection on with Loadsmart for you as a customer. Then correct on then it's treated as a carrier contract setup beyond that. So just reach out, and if you have any problems, there's also a ticketing system within MercuryGate. For other TMSs, I would think you need to go through their processes for enablement. So.
Awesome, thanks, Jim. Another question here, how much historical data does Loadsmart need to create API rate cards?
That's a good question, actually, because historical customers, or existing customers, I should say, we usually have a decent amount of data, especially if they have a high volume of loads moving through the integration or high volume of calls coming through. So it's easier for us to do that. So say the example of a new customer just turning on, we have zero information to go on. One thing that we typically would recommend is to enable the integration. But what we can do is set it up so that on our end, we basically set such an artificially low rate ceiling that it's going to block every rate response coming back. So there's no risk of loads accidentally being auto-tendered to Loadsmart before we're ready to go live. But it allows us to basically gather some data on your network and start to look at your lanes and things like that, and make a more data-driven decision around those initial rate ceiling settings. Typically, I know we've talked earlier about how easy it is to turn us on and start seeing those rates. It's 100% true. For us to be successful long term, we do prefer to have at least somewhat, an onboarding process that we stick to, which is pretty thorough on our end. But typically, with a customer, we can do that within a week or two easily. But within that week, we can start gathering those quotes. And then by the time we've done a couple of meetings just to clarify all the service expectations, communication, all the typical onboarding stuff, we can take a look at the quote and book analysis and say, okay, here's where we should start. Ideally, a week is probably on the low end, and then maybe 2 weeks to a month is ideal to really dial it in. But there's no real harm in starting early, because you can start conservatively as you want. And then it's not a set it and forget it. We're going to continuously meet and figure out what's the most appropriate level of support that you want.
Great. And that actually is a nice segue into another question we have here, which are, what are some of the things you look at when you go to set a rate ceiling?
Again, if it's an existing customer, we can see where we tend to win freight. If we're familiar with your business, we're going to know that certain facilities operate a certain way. So, do we only receive morning appointments or just unattractive appointments? Or do you tend to work on really low lead time or high weekend volumes? Or are you a great shipper with a ton of flexibility and drivers really like going there? Then we're going to be more aggressive. But we prefer to let the data do as much of the guidance as possible through those. If it's not, then we're going to, I would say, my recommendation would be for a new customer, we would have an even more thorough onboarding program if the intention was to start out fresh with a rate ceiling or rate guard program being implemented, just to give us a better feel for a lot of those conditions that are ultimately going to affect our pricing. And just as you might want to start with a conservative rate ceiling on your end as the shipper, on our end, we're going to do the exact same thing with our quoting rules and our pricing and things like that, so that we can learn your business, because it's very hard to get a new customer. It's very easy to lose one. So we want to set ourselves up for success as well. We're open about, hey, we're going to try to limit how many loads we take per day. If you can help with that, that's great. That's going to reduce our risk again. Hey, we're going to start out a little more conservative with our pricing, and then we're going to make sure that that we understand your business better before we start getting really aggressive and starting to support you more by taking on more volume. It's very much a work in progress.
Great. We do have a question from Dimitri, who is wondering, do you quote Canada API?
We do. Yeah, we do into and out of Canada, and also intra-Canada. We do not do anything in or out of Mexico.
Okay. And then with respect to, I know you had referenced new customers, what data would you use for a new customer looking to decide on a rate guard ceiling?
There's always an option for a customer to share rate information with us. Or I shouldn't say rate information. Lane information would be good if they can And this could be difficult depending on their access to information, but if they could send us quote requests that they've sent out, especially if they can just download like an ad hoc from their TMS to see when a quote was requested and what the expected pickup date, so we could actually factor in that lead time into the lane level data. We'd be able to do an analysis, quote and book analysis, even though we weren't bidding on it in real time. Get enough of a flavor for what they're moving and where it's going and all those things to be able to make some recommendations. But otherwise, I would just recommend that you reach out to MercuryGate, you enable the API. We just process quotes without actually returning anything, which is just a collection of data phase that would allow us to come to you with better recommendations.
Great. It looks like I only see one other question, so I'd encourage anybody else who may have a question, please go ahead and submit it. But one question here asks, what types of regional ceilings can you set? DMA, custom, etc.
I mean, as far as a regional, we can build that out or customize as much as you want. So it doesn't have to be like an external party's definition of a region, like to say Northeast. We can enter them as a combination, any combination of states or cities or zip codes. It's very highly customizable. So really, it just depends on the needs of your network and how specific you would want that to be, or how you would define the regions technically. And then again, we can talk about what level of support you need, what level of a rate ceiling for the rate card program is appropriate. But it's all very collaborative, using existing data or kind of a discovery process if you were a new customer. We're just trying to feel out what makes sense.
Great. I do looks like a couple questions came through after you were answering that one. One is a follow-up from Dimitri, who's asking, do you quote LTL or multi-stop API?
We can do multi-stop truckload shipments. We're not able to do LTL yet. We are working on that actually with MercuryGate currently, but that is not currently enabled.
Okay, great. And Marco asks, he'd like to know if the tender process works for individual loads or batches, and if it works in both cases, are there any differences in dynamic pricing strategies?
Well, no, we have customers that do both. Certainly individual shipments is no problem at all. There is increased risk with customers who do batch tendering, just because sometimes those can happen so immediately that it's actually difficult for basically our system to say stop. So ultimately, that's one of the things we talk about during the onboarding process is, hey, if you're doing batch tendering, is there a way for you to limit maybe 5 or 8 loads per lane per day, or whatever the lane may be? If it's a really difficult one, we might say, can you stop it at 2? And that'll allow us to basically be more aggressive with our pricing. But the more, the higher the risk profile based on those, shippers' tendencies, I guess you could say, the more that we have to factor that into our pricing and hedge, I guess. So it's ultimately going to lead to higher rates coming through. And if there's a rate ceiling in place, then that might actually lead to them just being rejected outright because they're over the rate ceiling.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions, Mike and Jim, so I may just hand it back to you here at the end. For those of you that joined us today, I appreciate you taking the time to hear Mike and Jim speak to the services that are offered. We really appreciate you joining this CSEMP webinar. For those of you that have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with Mike and Jim. I'm sure they would love to hear from you. But with that being said, we thank each of you for joining us today and hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Jim.
Bye-bye.